There is a strange and uncomfortable truth hiding in plain sight. The happiest human beings who have ever lived were not rich. They were not famous. Several of them were slaves. One was exiled to a frozen rock in the middle of the sea. Another buried his own sons. And yet these men wrote words so calm, so steady, so quietly joyful, that 2,000 years later, millionaires, therapists, athletes, and soldiers still read them at 3 a.m., searching for peace they cannot buy. What did they know that we don't? Because somewhere between the promotion you got and the empty feeling that followed, between the perfect vacation photo and the anxiety that crept in the moment you landed home, a question has probably crossed your mind. Why does more never feel like enough? Why do some people with so little radiate a kind of calm you can't seem to find no matter how much you accumulate? Stay with me for the next 30 minutes, because I'm going to walk you through 7 habits hidden in ancient texts, practiced quietly by the calmest and happiest people on this planet. Habit number 4 sounds almost backwards when you first hear it, but it may be the single most life-changing idea in this entire video. And by the time we reach the end, you will understand exactly why some of the wisest men in history said that happiness was never something you chase. It was something you already had, buried under habits nobody ever taught you to break. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the home for timeless philosophy that helps you build an unshakable mind in a world that never stops shaking. If you're new here, this channel exists for one simple reason. The ancient Stoics figured out how to live with strength, clarity, and quiet joy centuries before modern psychology gave it fancy names. Every video here takes those 2,000-year-old lessons and turns them into something you can actually use today in your real life with your real problems. So if that sounds like something you need, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because a new piece of this puzzle arrives regularly, and you won't want to miss where this one is going. Now let's get into it. Think about the last time you felt truly, deeply content. Not excited, not entertained, content. Chances are, it wasn't during some grand achievement. It probably wasn't your birthday, or the day you bought something you'd wanted for months. It was something small. Maybe it was an ordinary evening, a quiet walk, a conversation with someone you love, with nowhere else to be. And yet so much of modern life is built on the opposite premise. We are told relentlessly that happiness is somewhere out there. It's in the next job title, the next relationship, the next number in your bank account, the next version of yourself, thinner, richer, more accomplished, more admired. So we run, we climb, we scroll, we compare, and every time we reach the thing we were chasing, happiness is somehow still standing a little further down the road, waving at us just out of reach. Roughly 2,000 years ago, a group of thinkers we now call the Stoics diagnosed this exact problem with terrifying accuracy. Men like Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world at the time, an emperor who commanded armies and ruled over 60 million people. Men like Epictetus, who began his life in chains as a slave, his leg permanently crippled by a cruel master, and yet became one of the most respected teachers in Rome. And men like Seneca, a statesman and playwright who advised an emperor, amassed enormous wealth, and then was ordered to end his own life, facing death with a composure that stunned everyone who witnessed it. 3 wildly different lives, an emperor, a slave, and a senator. And yet all 3 arrived at the same conclusion. Happiness is not an event. It is not a possession. It is not even primarily an emotion. Happiness, they argued, is a byproduct of how you think, how you act, and what habits you build into the architecture of your daily life. This video is not going to give you 7 quotes to feel inspired by for an afternoon. I want to hand you 7 functioning habits, practiced daily by history's calmest minds, and increasingly validated by modern psychology, that you can start using today. Some of them will feel intuitive, others will feel almost uncomfortable, because they ask you to let go of things you've been clinging to for years. Let's start with the habit that changes everything else that follows. Habit 1. They draw a line around what is actually theirs. Imagine two men standing in the exact same traffic jam. Same road, same delay, same missed appointment on the other end of that jam. One of them is gripping the wheel, jaw clenched, heart hammering, muttering under his breath about the incompetence of everyone around him. The other is sitting quietly, maybe listening to music, completely at ease. Same external event. Two entirely different internal worlds. What separates them isn't personality. It's a single distinction that the Stoics placed at the absolute center of their entire philosophy, a concept Epictetus called the dichotomy of control. Here is how Epictetus began his most famous work, the Enchiridion. Some things are within our power, and some are not. Our opinions, our desires, our aversions, our own actions, these are within our power. Our bodies, our property, our reputation, the actions of others, the outcomes of events, these are not within our power. Epictetus wasn't offering a comforting platitude. He was handing you a filter. One you're meant to run every single stressful moment of your life through. When something disturbs you, when anxiety or anger or grief rises in your chest, you stop and ask one question: is this actually within my control? Traffic is not within your control. The words someone says about you behind your back are not within your control. Whether your business succeeds in a volatile economy is not entirely within your control. The health of someone you love is not within your control. But how you respond to all of it, that is entirely, completely, 100% yours. Here's why this single habit is so foundational to happiness. Almost all human suffering comes from investing emotional energy into things outside this line. We rage at traffic as if our fury could clear the road. We obsess over what strangers think of us, as if we could reach into their minds and rewrite their opinions. We exhaust ourselves trying to control outcomes that were never ours to control in the first place. And then we call that exhaustion stress, as if it's simply an unavoidable feature of modern life. It isn't. It's a symptom of misplaced focus. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire during a plague and constant war, wrote this in his private journal, never intended for publication, only for his own eyes. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Think about what it must have taken for a Roman emperor, a man responsible for the fate of millions, facing invasions on multiple fronts and a pandemic sweeping through his own household, to write that sentence to himself, not because he was naive about the chaos surrounding him, but because he understood something that took most of us decades to learn. If we ever learn it at all, his peace could not depend on the chaos resolving. It had to come from somewhere else. Modern psychology has essentially rediscovered this idea and given it new names. Cognitive behavioral therapy is built substantially on the premise that our emotional reactions are shaped less by events themselves and more by our interpretation of those events. Locus of control research consistently shows that people who believe they have influence over their own responses report significantly higher life satisfaction than those who feel like passengers in their own lives. The ancient insight and the modern data are pointing at the exact same door. So here is the practical version of this habit, the version you can start using today. The next time you feel that familiar surge of frustration, whether it's a cancelled flight, a rude comment, a decision that didn't go your way, pause for 3 seconds and silently ask, is this mine to control? If the answer is no, you're not obligated to keep fighting it in your mind. You're allowed to set it down, not because you don't care, but because caring about something you cannot change only manufactures suffering with no corresponding benefit. If the answer is yes, if it genuinely is within your control, then that's your invitation to act calmly and deliberately instead of spiraling. I want you to try something before we move to the next habit. Think of one thing right now that has been quietly stressing you out this week. Got it? Now ask yourself honestly, is that actually within my control? Or have I just been carrying weight that was never mine to carry? Drop a comment below with just one word, either mine or not mine. I read these, and I promise you, seeing how many people are carrying weight, that was never theirs might be exactly the reminder. Someone else scrolling through these comments needs today. This first habit is the foundation everything else in this video is built on. Because once you stop wasting your energy on what you cannot control, something remarkable happens. You suddenly have an enormous surplus of energy left over for the things you actually can influence. And that surplus is where the next habit begins. Habit 2. They rehearse loss before it arrives. This next habit sounds on the surface like the opposite of happiness. Stay with me because it is one of the most counterintuitive and powerful tools in the entire Stoic toolkit. The Stoics had a practice called premeditatio malorum, which translates roughly to the premeditation of evils. Seneca described it plainly in one of his letters. Nothing ought to be unexpected by us. Our minds should be sent forward in advance to meet all problems, and we should consider not what is wont to happen, but what can happen. In practice, this meant the Stoics would deliberately, briefly, imagine losing the things they valued most. Before a journey, imagine the ship sinking. Before a big meeting, imagine it going badly. Before saying goodbye to someone you love, imagine just for a moment that this could be the last time you see them. Now, your first instinct might be that this sounds like a recipe for anxiety, not happiness. Isn't imagining disaster the exact opposite of what a happy person does? But the Stoics discovered something that modern psychologists have since confirmed through research on a phenomenon called hedonic adaptation. Here's what hedonic adaptation means. Human beings are wired to get used to things extremely quickly. That new house that felt like a miracle the day you moved in, within a few months, it's just your house. That relationship that once felt like magic, the magic fades into familiarity unless you actively work to preserve it. Even lottery winners, studied extensively by researchers, tend to return to roughly their previous baseline of happiness within about a year, because the human brain adapts to almost anything, good or bad. This adaptation is precisely why happiness feels so elusive. We take everything for granted almost instantly. We stop seeing our health, our relationships, our safety, our basic comforts, because familiarity makes them invisible. Premeditatio malorum is a deliberate interruption of that process. By briefly imagining the loss of something, you make it visible again. You remember its value. Not because you're inviting tragedy into your life, but because you're refusing to let comfort make you blind to what you already have. Here's a story that captures this perfectly. Marcus Aurelius, before he became emperor, was taught by his Stoic tutors to greet each morning by reminding himself of the difficulties the day might bring. I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful. But he didn't stop there in despair. He used that mental rehearsal to prepare himself to meet those difficulties with patience rather than shock. When the difficult moment actually arrived, it didn't ambush him. He had already met it in his mind hours before. There's a deeply human, almost unbearably tender version of this practice too. Imagine just for 30 seconds right now that today was the last day you would ever get to speak with someone you love. Not because anything is wrong, just imagine it. Feel how differently you would listen to their voice, how much more patient you'd be with their small annoying habits, how much you'd want to tell them instead of assuming there's always tomorrow, that feeling you just experienced. That's not sadness, that's clarity. And it's available to you every single day for free. The moment you stop assuming, the people and things you love are guaranteed to remain exactly as they are. This is why the happiest people, the calmest and most grateful people you'll ever meet, often aren't the ones who have experienced the least loss. Frequently it's the opposite. People who have brushed against real loss, a serious illness, a close call, the death of someone dear, often describe a strange gift buried inside the grief, an inability to take ordinary Tuesdays for granted anymore. The Stoics figured out how to access that same clarity without needing tragedy. To force it on you, I want to be careful here, because this habit is easy to misuse. Premeditatio malorum is not meant to be practiced obsessively, and it is absolutely not a tool for people already struggling with anxiety or catastrophic thinking to lean on unsupervised. It is a brief, deliberate exercise, 30 seconds, maybe a minute, not a spiral. If imagining loss ever starts to feel consuming rather than clarifying, that's a signal to step back and talk to someone you trust, or a professional, rather than push further into it alone. Used correctly in small doses, this habit becomes a kind of gratitude accelerant. Try this tonight. Before you fall asleep, spend 30 seconds imagining your life without one specific thing you have right now: your health, your home, a person you love. Then open your eyes back into reality, where you still have it. Notice what that does to your chest. If this idea is landing with you, let me know in the comments which version hit hardest: imagining the loss of a person, or the loss of something material. I think the answer says a lot about what we actually value versus what we spend most of our energy chasing. Habit 3. They treat their mind like a fortress, not a hallway. Let's talk about something Marcus Aurelius called the inner citadel. A citadel, historically, was the fortified core of a city, the last line of defense. Even if enemies breached the outer walls, even if the streets outside were overrun, the citadel remained standing, impenetrable, untouched. Marcus Aurelius used this image to describe the human mind. No matter what chaos surrounds you outside, he argued, your inner citadel, your capacity to choose your own judgments and responses, can remain sovereign, untouched by external events, if you choose to defend it. Here's the problem most of us have. We treat our minds like hallways instead of fortresses. Every stray comment, every notification, every bit of bad news, every rude stranger, walks right through, tracks mud across the floor, and leaves whenever it wants, while we stand there rearranging the furniture to accommodate the mess. Marcus Aurelius lived through a genuine hallway of horrors, wars on multiple fronts, a devastating plague, likely smallpox, that killed an estimated 5 million people across the empire, including members of his own family. Constant political betrayals, including a rebellion led by one of his own trusted generals. And yet, reading his private journal, the Meditations, what strikes you isn't despair. It's a man actively, deliberately, sometimes visibly struggling to keep his inner citadel standing amid all of it. He wrote to himself, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." He wrote, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it." He wrote in perhaps his most famous line, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." These weren't abstract philosophical musings for an academic audience. This was a man in the middle of a genuine catastrophe, coaching himself back to his fortress every single night. So how do you actually build an inner citadel in your own life? The Stoics offered something they called the discipline of assent. In simple terms, it means recognizing that between any event and your reaction to it, there is a gap, a space where you get to choose what you will assent to, or agree with about that event. Someone insults you. That's the event. Your mind immediately wants to generate a story. They're right. I really am inadequate, or how dare they? I'll never forgive this. But the Stoics would say, pause in that gap. You do not have to assent to either story. You can simply observe, someone said something unkind, and choose your response deliberately rather than being dragged by the current of your first reaction. This is remarkably close to what modern mindfulness-based therapy calls cognitive diffusion, the practice of separating yourself from your automatic thoughts long enough to choose a response, rather than simply react, 2,000 years apart, arriving at the same door. Building this fortress isn't about becoming cold or emotionless. Marcus Aurelius wasn't unfeeling. He grieved, he worried, he documented his own frustration honestly in his journal. The citadel isn't about refusing to feel. It's about refusing to let every feeling instantly become a decision. It's the difference between feeling anger and being ruled by anger, between feeling fear and being ruled by fear. Here's a simple daily practice. Each time you notice a strong emotional reaction rising, whether it's irritation, hurt, or anxiety, silently name it. Just say to yourself, quietly, this is anger, or this is fear. That single act of naming creates the smallest sliver of space, the gap the Stoics talked about, between you and the emotion. And in that gap is where your freedom lives. The happiest people you know are rarely the ones who feel less. They're usually the ones who have learned, often through hard-won experience, how to widen that gap just slightly, enough to choose their next move instead of being ambushed by their own reactions. If you've made it this far into the video, I'd genuinely love it if you hit that like button right now. It's a small action, but it tells YouTube to show this to more people who might need to hear it. And honestly, it costs you nothing, but might mean everything to someone scrolling past this later tonight. Habit 4. They fall in love with their own life, exactly as it is. Here is the habit I mentioned at the very beginning, the one that sounds almost backwards the first time you hear it. The Stoics called it amor fati, love of fate, not tolerance of fate, not acceptance of fate, gritted teeth, white knuckles, enduring what cannot be changed. Love of fate, an active, deliberate embrace of everything that has happened to you, including the parts that hurt, including the mistakes, including the losses, as somehow necessary threads in the fabric of the life you're currently living. This sounds almost offensive when you first encounter it, doesn't it? Are we really supposed to love the layoff? Love the breakup? Love the diagnosis? Love the years we wasted on the wrong path? Nietzsche, centuries later, borrowed this exact Stoic concept and phrased the test beautifully. What if you had to live this same life, with every joy and every suffering, over and over again, infinitely, exactly as it happened? Could you say yes to that? Could you love it enough to want it repeated? Here's the key distinction that unlocks this entire habit. Amor fati is not about pretending painful things were good. It's not toxic positivity dressed up in a toga. It's about recognizing that the past has already happened, and no amount of resistance, resentment, or what-if thinking can rewrite a single second of it. Your energy has exactly two possible destinations. You can spend it fighting a past that cannot be changed, or you can spend it building a future with the material that past has left you. Marcus Aurelius put it with characteristic bluntness. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. In other words, the obstacle isn't separate from your path. Very often the obstacle is the material your path is made of. Think of the most resilient, quietly happy people you've ever personally known. Chances are, almost none of them had an easy, uninterrupted life. Chances are, many of them survived something significant. A difficult childhood, an illness, a devastating loss, a failed business, a broken relationship. And yet somehow they don't talk about that chapter with bitterness. They talk about it often as the moment that made them who they are, not because the event itself was good, because they refused to let it become the villain of a story they were forced to keep reliving in resentment. This is the difference between two people who experience the exact same hardship. One spends the next decade asking, "Why did this happen to me?" A question with no satisfying answer, that keeps the wound perpetually open. The other asks, "What can this teach me? And what can I build now that I know this?" A question that actually has an answer, and one that moves them forward. I want to gently address something here, because this habit can be misunderstood in a harmful way if it's applied carelessly. Amor fati is not a demand that you feel grateful for genuine trauma, abuse, or tragedy the moment it happens. And it's not a substitute for grieving something that deserves to be grieved, or for seeking real support and professional help when pain runs deep. This is a long-term orientation you grow into, often slowly, sometimes with help, not an instant switch you flip in the middle of acute suffering. The Stoics themselves grieved. Seneca wrote extensively and honestly about grief. This habit is about where you eventually choose to place your energy once the immediate wound has had time and space to be tended to, not a denial that the wound exists. With that said, here's a practical way to start building this habit in the ordinary, everyday frustrations of life, the ones far smaller than trauma. The next time something goes wrong, a plan falls through, a mistake gets made, a door closes, try asking out loud if you can, "What does this make possible now?" That wasn't possible 5 minutes ago. You'll be surprised how often an honest answer exists, even if it's small. Missing that flight might mean an extra conversation with a stranger who changes your perspective. Losing that job might mean finally building the thing you'd been too comfortable to start. This is the habit that separates people who are perpetually waiting for their real life to begin once circumstances improve, from people who have quietly decided that this, right now, exactly as it is, imperfect and unfinished, is already the real life worth loving. What's one moment in your life that felt like a disaster at the time, but that you can now honestly say you're grateful happened? I'd genuinely love to read these in the comments. Sometimes the most powerful thing on this entire channel isn't anything I say. It's watching hundreds of strangers remind each other, through their own stories, that the worst chapters aren't always the final verdict. Habit 5. They remember that time is the only currency that never refills. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly. If I offered to trade you an extra 10 years of life in exchange for every dollar in your bank account, would you take the deal? Most people, when they actually stop and think about it, say yes instantly. And yet, watch how most of us actually spend our days. We protect our money obsessively, we budget it, we invest it, we agonize over losing even small amounts of it. But we spend our time, the one resource we cannot recover no matter how successful we become, with almost total carelessness. Hours vanish into distraction. Entire evenings dissolve into anxiety about things outside our control, which we already discussed in Habit 1. Years slip by while we wait for some future moment when we'll finally start really living. Seneca wrote an entire essay on exactly this problem, called On the Shortness of Life. His argument was radical for its time and remains radical today. Life isn't short. We make it short by wasting it. He wrote that people are extraordinarily protective of their property, their money, their possessions, but shockingly careless with the one thing that's actually irreplaceable, their time, giving it away freely to anyone who asks for it, to distractions, to grudges, to activities that leave nothing behind. This is closely connected to a second Stoic concept, one that sounds morbid at first but is actually one of the most life-affirming ideas in the entire philosophy: memento mori. Remember that you will die. Roman generals, according to tradition, would have a servant whisper this phrase to them during their victory parades. At the exact height of their glory and public adoration, remember, you are mortal. Not to depress them, to keep them honest, to remind them that status, applause, and accomplishment are ultimately temporary, and that the only thing that truly matters is how they spend the finite days actually in front of them. Marcus Aurelius kept this awareness close at all times. He wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." This wasn't a call to despair. It was a call to urgency and clarity. If you genuinely internalize that your time here is finite and uncertain, would you really spend another evening scrolling mindlessly through content that makes you feel worse about your own life? Would you really put off telling someone you love them or reaching out to repair a relationship for one more month, one more year? Here's what's fascinating. Research on people who have survived near-death experiences or received serious health diagnoses consistently reports the same psychological shift: a sudden, sharpened clarity about what actually matters, a newfound intolerance for pettiness, grudges, and time-wasting. Relationships they'd neglected suddenly become urgent priorities. Work that felt meaningless suddenly gets reevaluated. In essence, these people are forced, often against their will, into the exact mental posture the Stoics deliberately cultivated on purpose, without needing a crisis to force it on them. This is why memento mori isn't morbid. It's the opposite. It's one of the most effective tools for actually appreciating being alive that has ever been developed, because scarcity is what makes anything valuable, and nothing is scarcer than the number of days you actually have left. A number none of us know, but all of us are spending down every single day regardless. Here's a practical exercise, one you can do right now, that brings this habit into your ordinary week. Look at your calendar or your typical daily routine. Identify one activity you do regularly that, if you're honest with yourself, adds nothing to your life. Maybe it's an hour of mindless scrolling before bed. Maybe it's rehashing the same old argument in your head for the 100th time. Whatever it is this week, replace just 30 minutes of it with something that actually matters to you. A call to someone you've been meaning to reach. 10 pages of a book you've wanted to read. A walk with no phone in your pocket. That's it. That's the whole practice. Small, deliberate reclaiming of a resource you cannot get back, spent instead on something that will still matter to you a year from now. Habit 6. They build their self-worth on things no one can take from them. Let's talk about Epictetus for a moment, because his story makes this next habit almost impossible to argue with. Epictetus was born into slavery around 50 AD. His name, in fact, likely wasn't even his real name. Epictetus simply means acquired or gained in Greek, essentially property. His master, a man named Epaphroditus, was reportedly cruel, and at some point, either through abuse or an accident, Epictetus's leg was permanently crippled. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He owned essentially nothing. He had no political power, no wealth, no physical freedom for a significant portion of his life. And even after eventually gaining his freedom, he lived with extreme simplicity, famously teaching that he required almost nothing beyond a simple hut and a lamp. And yet Epictetus became one of the most respected and influential philosophers in the entire Roman world. Students traveled great distances to study under him. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who ruled decades after Epictetus's death, quoted him extensively and considered his teachings foundational to his own thinking. A man with no possessions and a broken body became a teacher to an emperor who ruled most of the known world. How is that possible? Because Epictetus built his entire sense of worth and identity on something that could never be confiscated. His own character, judgment, and choices. He taught his students relentlessly to distinguish between what he called externals, wealth, reputation, physical ability, other people's opinions, and what he called things up to us, our values, our intentions, our integrity, our choices. This is one of the most quietly radical ideas in the entire Stoic tradition, and it directly addresses one of the biggest reasons modern people struggle with lasting happiness. We tend to anchor our self-worth to things that are fundamentally unstable. Our job title, which can disappear in a single round of layoffs. Our physical appearance, which changes with time regardless of what we do. Our social status, which shifts based on trends and circumstances entirely outside our control. Other people's approval, which can vanish the moment we say or do something unpopular. When your sense of worth is built on any of these external foundations, your happiness becomes a hostage to circumstances you cannot fully control. Lose the job and you feel worthless. Age past your physical prime and you feel invisible. Face public criticism and you feel destroyed. The foundation was never solid to begin with because it was never actually yours. Epictetus taught something entirely different. Build your identity on your character instead. On whether you acted with integrity today, on whether you kept your word, on whether you treated people fairly, even when it cost you something, on whether you did your work honestly, regardless of who was watching. These things, unlike wealth or reputation or physical ability, cannot be taken from you by external circumstances. They can only be surrendered by you through your own choices. This is precisely why a crippled former slave could stand toe-to-toe, philosophically, with the most powerful man in the world, and why the emperor was the one taking notes. Marcus Aurelius had every external marker of worth that society could offer: absolute power, immense wealth, the adoration of an empire, and still he turned to the teachings of a man who had none of those things. Because Epictetus had built something Marcus recognized as more valuable and more stable, unshakable inner integrity. Here's how you can start applying this today. At the end of each day, instead of asking yourself the questions most of us default to, did I look good today? Did people like me today? Did I achieve enough today? Try asking a different set of questions instead. Did I act with integrity today? Did I keep my commitments? Did I treat the people around me with fairness and respect, even when no one would have noticed if I hadn't? These questions build a foundation that external chaos cannot easily shake, because the answer doesn't depend on the economy, on other people's moods, on your physical appearance, or on your bank account. It depends entirely on you, which means it's one of the only foundations for self-worth that remains genuinely, permanently within your control. Habit 7. They treat other people's flaws the way they want their own forgiven. We've spent this entire video looking inward, at your own mind, your own habits, your own perception of control. This final habit turns outward because the Stoics understood something crucial. You cannot build lasting happiness in isolation. How you relate to other people, especially the people who frustrate, disappoint, or hurt you, has an enormous impact on your own inner peace. Marcus Aurelius opened many of his private journal entries with a version of the same reminder, preparing himself for the people he was about to encounter that day. Here's roughly what he told himself every single morning. Before facing the demands of ruling an empire, today I will meet people who are meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They act this way because they don't understand the difference between good and evil. But I have recognized the nature of goodness, and I know that no one can truly implicate me in anything shameful, nor can I feel angry towards someone who shares my nature. We were born to work together, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like rows of upper and lower teeth. To oppose one another is against nature. Read that again. This was the private journal of the most powerful man alive, mentally rehearsing patience and forgiveness for the difficult people he was about to encounter, before he'd even left his bed in the morning. Why would an emperor bother doing this? Because Marcus understood something profound. Anger and resentment toward others don't punish the other person nearly as much as they punish the person carrying them. He wrote elsewhere, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it?" Think about the last time someone genuinely wronged you. Maybe they were unfair or unkind, or simply incompetent in a way that cost you something. Now think about how much time you spent afterward, replaying the moment, rehearsing what you should have said, feeling that hot flush of resentment resurface hours, or even days later. That person, in most cases, has completely forgotten the interaction and moved on with their evening. You're the one still carrying it, still paying an emotional tax on an event that's already over. The Stoics weren't suggesting you become a doormat, or that you should never set boundaries, or that injustice doesn't matter. Marcus Aurelius ruled with real authority and made real decisions, including difficult ones. This isn't about permitting mistreatment. It's about recognizing that carrying resentment is a form of self-punishment for someone else's behavior, and that forgiveness in the Stoic sense isn't primarily a gift you give the other person. It's a decision you make to stop paying rent, in your own mind, to an event that's already in the past. There's a beautifully practical piece of Stoic wisdom here, too, the idea that most people who wrong us do so out of ignorance, not malice. They genuinely believe in the moment that what they're doing is reasonable or justified, or simply don't know any better. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but understanding it can drain the personal sting out of it. The rude stranger at the store isn't plotting against you specifically. The colleague who took credit for your idea likely convinced themselves it was deserved. Understanding this doesn't mean tolerating harm. It means recognizing that most unkindness comes from someone else's limitation, not evidence of your own worthlessness. Seneca offered a wonderfully practical technique for managing anger before it takes hold. Delay. He suggested that when you feel the first flash of anger rising, you should deliberately give yourself time before responding, even a short pause, because in that gap, the initial intensity naturally fades and clearer judgment has room to return. This is remarkably consistent with what modern research on emotional regulation has found. The initial surge of an intense emotion typically peaks and begins subsiding within about 90 seconds if you don't feed it further with escalating thoughts. Seneca figured this out, in essence, roughly 2,000 years before any laboratory confirmed it. Here's your practice for this habit. The next time someone frustrates or hurts you, before reacting, try silently asking, what would I want if I were the one who made this mistake? Would I want to be defined forever by this one moment? Or would I want a chance to be understood and maybe even forgiven? Extending that same grace outward, not because the other person necessarily deserves it, but because carrying constant resentment is a weight you don't have to keep lifting, is one of the quietest, most consistent habits shared by genuinely happy, peaceful people. Let's step back for a moment and look at what we've actually covered. We started with the dichotomy of control, learning to draw a clear line between what is genuinely ours to influence and what isn't, and releasing our grip on everything outside that line. We moved to premeditatio malorum, using brief, deliberate imagination of loss to restore our appreciation for what we already have, before hedonic adaptation quietly steals it from our awareness. We explored the inner citadel, the practice of defending a small but sacred gap between events and our reactions to them. We confronted amor fati, the radical decision to stop fighting a past that cannot be changed and instead build forward with whatever material that past has left us. We sat with memento mori, letting the awareness of our own mortality sharpen rather than frighten us, reminding us that time, not money, is the resource we can least afford to waste. We examined how Epictetus, a man who owned nothing and had every external reason to feel worthless, built an unshakable identity on the one thing that could never be confiscated, his own character. And we finished with the outward-facing habit of releasing resentment, recognizing that forgiveness is often less about the other person and more about refusing to keep paying an emotional tax on events already in the past. Notice something about all 7 of these habits. Not one of them requires more money. Not one requires more time in the day, more followers, more status, or more approval from anyone else. Every single one of them is available to you, starting today, regardless of your circumstances, because every single one of them is fundamentally about where you choose to direct your attention and your judgment. The one resource the Stoics insisted was always entirely within your control. This is precisely why an emperor, a slave, and a wealthy statesman could all arrive at the exact same conclusions about happiness, despite living in completely different circumstances, because happiness, as they understood it, was never actually a matter of circumstance in the first place. Here's something worth sitting with as we close. You don't need to master all 7 of these habits simultaneously, starting tomorrow morning. That's not how lasting change works, and honestly, expecting instant transformation is its own kind of trap. Another way of chasing something out there, instead of building something steady, day by day. Pick just one. The one that resonated with you the most as you listened. Maybe it was the dichotomy of control. Maybe it was amor fati. Maybe it was releasing resentment towards someone who's been occupying too much space in your head. Whichever one it was, practice just that single habit this week. Not perfectly, just consistently. Notice what shifts. And then, when you're ready, come back and add another. The happiest people on this earth were never the ones who had the fewest problems. They were the ones who built the strongest, most consistent habits for meeting those problems. And that door is open to you, starting the moment you decide to walk through it. If even one of these 7 habits gave you something to genuinely think about today, do me a favor and let me know which one in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, this community's reflections often teach me as much as the philosophy itself does. If this video added real value to your day, consider tapping that like button. It's the single biggest factor in whether YouTube decides to show this to someone else who might desperately need to hear it today. And if you know someone who's been quietly struggling to find peace, someone chasing happiness in all the wrong directions, consider sharing this video with them directly. Sometimes the right words landing at the right moment can shift the entire trajectory of someone's week or even their year. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics and turn on notifications, Because we're building something here together, a genuine library of timeless tools for building a calmer, stronger, more resilient mind, one video at a time. And I genuinely love for you to be here for what's coming next. Until next time, remember, you don't need more to be happy. You need less resistance to what already is. Take care of your inner citadel. I'll see you in the next one.